Hi. So with all this globalization going on, you decided to go into business internationally. You're going to encounter quite a few things that are different from how they are in your country. And today we're going to talk about some of them. So we're going to talk about differences in political systems, differences in perceptions of ethics, and differences in legal systems. Let me give you a few examples of how those differences can manifest themselves in the real world. For example, depending on what political system the country has where you want to do business, it may be necessary to do business differently. So you may have to approach different people, you may have to use different practices than those that you would use in your home country. For example, if you wanted to do business in Finland versus do business in Sierra Leone, as you can imagine, the countries are very different, not only economically but also politically. And so in one country, it may be more about your business idea and skills. In another country, it may be more about your connections and ability to please the ruling party. Laws may be different. For example, when I was living in Canada, when I first relocated to Canada, I would frequently see pictures like this one, as you see here behind me. And those looked like packages from, I couldn't figure out what those were, but they had nasty pictures of basically negative consequences of smoking. You would have, pictures of rotten teeth or liver or all kinds of other things. And being naive and, coming from a country where I wouldn't see packages like that, I immediately assumed that those were some sort of products that help people quit smoking. Only later on I figured out that those actually were cigarette packages, because turns out that in Canada, at least in the province where I lived, the law requires that a substantial portion of the cigarette surface area, package surface area, 70% if I remember correctly, be devoted to anti-smoking information. And the pictures would be provided by the state, so the tobacco companies couldn't choose what they put there. And so literally the package looks like an anti-smoking billboard with a very small portion of the area allocated to the actual brand name and cigarette promotion. Perceptions of bribe. Again, in one country it would be perfectly okay to offer some sort of gifts to either state officials or your business partners. In other countries it would not be okay, and where that okay becomes not okay differs from culture to culture. Let's say if I gave you a pen with the logo of my business school, would that be an acceptable gift? Probably so in most countries. What about a leather jacket with the logo of my school? Would that be too much? How about a scooter with the logo of my company? How about a car with a logo of my company? How about a car without a logo of my company? So at which point would you say it's too much and it's now unethical and it's a bribe as opposed to just simply an innocent gift? And then obviously you would have an interplay of all those three. Like you probably all have heard about the cases or trouble that Yahoo and Google were in China. So as you remember, the deal was that the Chinese government would allow them to operate in China only under the condition that some of the news will be censored, as well as the state would have access to the records of emails and other communication of the users of those services. And that's basically the law there. That's what the regulations are. And as you probably know, Google eventually decided not to operate in China and withdrew, so now Google services are not available there. And to my knowledge, Yahoo still operates there and apparently made a deal with the government. So the big question becomes, was it a right thing to do or a wrong thing to do? It's definitely legal, and in fact it would be illegal to do it otherwise. Is it moral? Is it ethical? Well, that's kind of a difficult question to ask. I mean, where does ethics stops and crime begins? That, to a large extent, depends on the country's legal, political, and ethical system. And that's what we're going to talk about today. First, some very minor theoretical background. As you can imagine, the political system is more of a spectrum rather than a type, right? And so you have a spectrum from a dictatorship where everything is controlled by the government, all the way pretty much to chaos or anarchism, where you have absolutely no central power or authority, and everybody is left to his own device. And somewhere in between, you would have some sort of a pluralism system, or as we often call it, a democracy, where there are a lot of freedoms given to the people, but there are also some central powers that do regulate some areas of life. Now, there are two different types of democracy, and most countries do have some form of democracy, and one would be pure, one would be representative. I would like to ask, what kind of democracy do you have in your country? And if you're my students in the United States, the question would be, what type of democracy does the United States have? The same question would apply to students if you happen to come from a different country. Most of my students know the answer, and they would say that yes, we are a representative democracy. A pure democracy doesn't really exist in its pure form, not at least anymore. I guess the best example would be the ancient Greece, where literally every citizen of the city-state would gather up in the central square, and if there is a question on which they need to make a decision, everybody would vote. Even that wasn't completely pure, because only male citizens and only wealthy or people who had some property were allowed to vote. For example, slaves, which they did have, wouldn't allow to vote. Commoners wouldn't allow to vote, as well as women wouldn't be allowed to vote. So as a result, I guess it wasn't quite as pure as some describe it. But yes, it was as close as it gets to pure democracy. In today's world, Switzerland is probably the closest example to the pure democracy. Switzerland has referendums on just about any issue that the government needs to decide on. And if I remember the numbers correctly, they have something like 300 referendums a year. So just about every day there would be some sort of a decision that people are invited to vote on. And it doesn't mean that they have elections, with the ballots and everything every single day. Most of those elections are actually electronic or online, and the participation rate apparently in an average referendum is not really that high. But still, the government does try to ask people on every single issue, and people do have a way to provide their input on every single issue. It sounds good in theory, but probably wouldn't work in a larger country. Like, for example, if you tried to implement it in the United States or even Germany, asking everybody about every small issue. Do you want to build a road here? Do you want to upgrade this school? Do you want to it just would be too difficult. People just don't have enough information to make an informative choice on many of those issues. So most countries today have a representative democracy. The way it works is you, the people, elect representatives, like your parliament members or maybe city council members, the president, the prime minister, or whatever system the country has. And those elected representatives then make decisions on your behalf. You kind of hope that they will represent your will, your desires during their time in the office. And if they don't, then yes, you just don't vote for them next time. You vote for someone else. Now, let's talk about each of those systems one by one, including their pros and cons. So on the one end of the spectrum, we have the totalitarianism. And you have all kinds of different totalitarian systems. If you are reading the textbook, you will have a few pages that explain the differences. Here is how I would describe them. So I created this table just to show you how each form of totalitarianism differs from the other forms of totalitarianism. So you basically have three different types of freedoms, or basic types of freedoms. You have economic freedom, you have political freedom, and you have personal freedom. And depending on which type of freedom is restricted, you would get a different type of totalitarianism. For example, in a pure form, a communism or communist totalitarianism limits your economic freedoms, right? So you would be allowed to do whatever you want to do politically or personally, but you cannot own property or do business privately. So everything belongs to the community. The truth is that, at least the history shows us that the communist societies or communist countries like the Soviet Union, like North Korea, they tended to greatly overstep this pure form and also try to limit political and personal freedoms. For example, as someone who grew up in the Soviet Union, I know too well that that presumably communist society had also one political party, so you could vote for anyone as long as that's the Communist Party representatives, and they quite severely limited personal freedoms as well. So, for example, religion was effectively forbidden. There were rather strict dress codes, hairstyles allowed, for example, for kids in school. So there were quite a few, restrictions. The famous "We have no sex" in one of the tele bridges between Russia and or Soviet Union at that time and America. So one of the girls said that the Soviet Union has no sex. So there were definitely some restrictions in that area. But again, in its pure form, communism would be a system where economic freedoms are limited. Everything else is more or less unregulated. Now, right-wing totalitarianism limits political freedoms. You would be allowed to do business the way you want. You would be allowed to own property and companies. You can do whatever you want to do in personal realm, dress the way you like, have whatever faith you like, but you wouldn't be allowed to compete in the political sector of life. A good example would be probably today's Russia, even though it's not a pure case. So in today's Russia, you can own a business, you can own property, you can do business whichever way you want. Personally, again, there are very few restrictions, the way you dress, whatever else you want to do in the personal life. But in the political life, even though there are on paper multiple parties, normally you don't argue with the main, with basically the guys in Kremlin. And so the opposition there is more or less puppets, right? So again, it's not quite a pure form, because even in the business life there, you have to have the connections with the Kremlin, and there have been many cases when your political dissent resulted in the destruction of your business, as it happened, for example, to the head of the Yukos company, Khodorkovsky, who spent a considerable amount of time in prison, as well as lost all his business empire. Same thing in the personal life. There are some restrictions, like, for example, gay rights are severely limited. Technically, you're not allowed, you're not forbidden from practicing homosexual love, but there are restrictions on how you can talk about that, or rather not talk about that or propagate it, and so it's not as free as it would be in the pure case. But that's, in today's world, I guess, a fairly close example to the right-wing totalitarianism. Theocratic totalitarianism is a very interesting animal. It's a system where economically the country is free, politically there may be some sort of competition, but there are all kinds of restrictions in the personal realm. So there would be basically a one faith approach, as well as the religious texts or religion would severely limit personal freedoms. Again, not a pure, but a close example would be modern days Saudi Arabia, where, again, the business sector of life is relatively free, and you can do business whichever way you want, even though it's probably a little, less free than in some other countries. Politically, again, at least theoretically, you have some competition, and so there is room for political dissent, though again not as much as it would be in the pure form. Personally, there are all kinds of restrictions. There are certain rules about the dress code, about behavior in public. Women, as you know, there are subjected to all kinds of restrictions, from restrictions on driving cars, to restrictions on voting, to the way they dress. In fact, in stores, there are even no dressing rooms. So if you want to buy some clothing, you get it, you take it with you home, you try it on at home. So there are all kinds of rules, and I'm not necessarily saying they're bad or good. I'm just saying that there are all kinds of rules about how you can behave in your personal life or as a person. Finally, probably the worst type of totalitarianism, the tribal totalitarianism. This is the one where your economic, political, and personal freedoms are restricted based on your race or tribal allegiances. So, for example, in Rwanda, some time ago, and to some extent even today, if you happen to come from their own tribe, they had the conflict between Tutsi and Hutu, right? So if you happen to be from your own tribe, you may not be allowed to, for example, do some sorts of business or participate in the political life, or even not choose, for example, where you live, or have other personal freedoms. We see this not as little as you would hope we would. So throughout the human history, there have been many examples when people of certain, for example, ethnic or tribal kind of background. And by tribe here, I don't necessarily mean a tribe, as some sort of savages. I'm talking about more like ethnicity or ethnic background. So where people of certain ethnic background wouldn't be allowed to, for example, own land, as it was at some point in time in some European countries for Jews and people of other religious or ethnic backgrounds, or may not be allowed, people of some ethnic background wouldn't be allowed to run for office, again, overtly or covertly, but that in many cases would be the case. Today it's a very rare type of system. I once had a student from Israel who said that Israel kind of to some extent has that system in place. So apparently for at least in the political area, so it seems like it's a Jewish state, and so there are apparently some restrictions on some jobs in a sense in the government that couldn't be, or it would be unthinkable that a non-Jew would get one of those jobs. But I'm not familiar enough with the system, and to my knowledge, at least as far as economic or personal freedoms, the country is pretty open, and to my knowledge, people of all kinds of religions and ethnic backgrounds successfully do business and express their religious or personal views there. But it seems like there are some restrictions that are worth noting, and probably that would be one of the distant but still kind of relevant examples in the context of this political system. I can imagine that there are other countries where tribal totalitarianism is not official, where on paper everybody is equal, but it would be unthinkable to see, for example, a businessman or a political leader coming from a particular background. So unfortunately, as I said, this type of system still exists, even if not always overtly. Here is a question that is likely to appear on the exam if you're taking my class for credit. And take a minute and see if you can guess which type of totalitarianism we're talking about here. And clearly, looking at this table here, we have a limited political freedom but unrestricted personal and economic freedoms. So the answer clearly is right-wing totalitarianism, C. Now, where is democracy and where is totalitarianism? Well, you kind of know that answer. So when we look at the map, the yellow areas are more politically free, or what we would call a democracy, and purple areas are not free, or what we would call some sort of totalitarianism. The picture is, if I remember correctly, from 2012, and so the world is always changing, so it may look a little different today. But yes, mostly we have political freedom in North America, in Europe, Australia, parts of Asia, and Latin America. Where you see mostly totalitarianism or some forms of it, that would be in most of Asia or parts of Asia, most of Africa, as well as Eastern Europe. And again, the situation is changing, especially looking at, for example, Russia and Ukraine in 2013, 14, 15. So just because yesterday a country was free doesn't mean it will be today or tomorrow, and vice versa. Where would you rather do business? Which ideology is better for economic growth? Those are very good questions, and I encourage you to pause here and think for a while for yourself. Most people obviously would prefer to do business in free, politically free societies or societies with a democratic system. But if you are in business to make money, you might want to not necessarily rethink your approach, but be more open. The thing is, In democratic societies, there is a lot of competition. Everybody who wants can, and many do, start their own party, their own business. And so as a result, you have a lot of competition. So profit margins are slim. If you look at the world that is highlighted purple on the map here, then if you go to the countries with purple, chances are it would be very difficult to do business there. But if you happen to succeed, if you happen to get the right connections, if you happen to establish a business, you actually may be up for a windfall of money. No competition. Competition is basically limited or non-existent due to the state control of the economic and political realms of the life. And if you happen to be one of those who actually does business there, you in many cases would have a monopolistic situation. So in many cases you would be allowed to charge, or will be able to charge, as much as you want, and your profit margins will be much, much higher. Same thing in terms of economic growth. I mean, many countries, or many people, and obviously there is some statistical evidence to that, believe that it's all about democracy if you want to be rich. And it is true, there is a strong correlation between political freedom or political system and economic prosperity. But we do have a lot of examples when economic freedom or political freedom didn't result in wealth. I mean, look at Africa. There are many countries there, or at least some countries there, that are free, but at the same time they're not necessarily rich. Same thing applies to Latin America, same thing applies to some Asian countries. At the same time, you have a number of countries that are very wealthy, yet they do not have a free, democratic society. Like, for example, when you look at Singapore, South Korea, Iran, Saudi Arabia, China, I mean, they are doing remarkably well economically, and yet those are the countries that I guess South Korea and Singapore would probably qualify for a democracy, but again, it's not quite the same democracy you would see, for example, in Finland, and especially not in the sense that those are not the types of democracies that brought the prosperity. I mean, South Korea and Singapore, over the last 40 or 50 years, when they've experienced the economic growth, I mean, those were not exactly your free democratic societies. In fact, the change and the prosperity was brought about by certain restrictions, and maybe sometimes even what people would call despotic rules and regulations and restrictions. So it seems like, yes, democracy does usually lead to prosperity, but democracy is not a sufficient condition for prosperity. And in many cases, democracy is not even a necessary condition for prosperity, as evident, as we can see from histories of some of the countries. Now, here is a question that would be likely to be on the exam, and so you basically want to have to tell me what parts of the world are totalitarian. And clearly the answer is C. So we see most of the totalitarianism in Africa and in Asia. Now, a very interesting question. Is democracy always better? Why don't all countries have a democracy? Or why not all people prefer democracy? Well, I'm a big democracy proponent, and I believe this is a good system, the best system. But as a politician said once, democracy is an excellent system. No, he said democracy is a terrible system, but it's the best one we've invented so far. And many people focus on that terrible part. Yes, it may be the best one we've invented so far, but not necessarily the best or perfect one. And there are many people who actually would disagree with that statement. So there are many, many people on this planet. In fact, I'm going to argue that it's probably at least 3 billion people, and possibly more, who are not democracy lovers. Even in democratic societies, you would hear calls for restrictions or being tough on whatever they believe is wrong, making it difficult, for example, hosting some political descendants or maybe some personal descendants, all kinds of restrictions that people want to impose. Even more people loan for kind of a strong hand or a good king type of approach. Go, for example, to my native Ukraine. It's striving to be democratic, but when you talk to the people, like, for example, my parents, they seem to prefer or kind of wait for the time when a strong guy will finally become the president and set the record straight and bring order to the society. And that's not what you would call a democracy. I mean, that's definitely not the case. And then you go to China, Russia, most of Africa. It seems like people there would prefer some sort of a strong hand rule, fair and just, but not the system that will give freedom to everyone. It would more like freedom to people who think like us. And again, who am I to tell that they are wrong? I mean, there are billions of those people. And I don't know, maybe they are not as wrong as they seem to us. As you may remember, a few years ago, Jackie Chan, the action movie hero, was in hot water for saying that the Chinese people are not ready for democracy, and for China it's best to have some sort of dictatorship in place. And his fans in Taiwan, Hong Kong were not pleased with his statements, and so he got a lot of bad rap on social media. But again, apparently many people would agree with him, and he doesn't look like a dumb guy to me. So I don't know, he may be voicing preferences of many people in that region. Now, a related issue is what we would call a political risk. Political risk basically is the risk of instability or some sort of changes in the society due to political turmoil that may determine or kind of prevent you from doing the business you would like to do. And so it can arise from all kinds of conflicts and violence, as you would see in Ukraine from 2013 to we'll see when it ends. I'm talking about it in 2015. Terrorist attacks, property seizures, confiscations, nationalizations, all those kinds of things, policies and laws changes. I'll give you just a few examples. For example, at some point in Venezuela, a bunch of companies were nationalized, basically taken from the private companies. And so if you happen to be an owner of that company and you happen to do business there at that time, yes, that political instability basically takes your business away, it takes all your investment away. And so it is risky. I mean, when you invest in a country or in a country with political instability, you always basically risk losing your investment. Many people think about political risk as something that happens only in developing countries or third world countries, but that is not quite the case. You would see political instability just about everywhere. You remember recent protests and violent riots in, for example, France. You look at Ukraine, that has always been a peaceful country, and what's happening there now is terrible, and nobody expected, but it did happen. So it can affect your business. So as a result, your company may have a limited list of options for obtaining materials, making products, hiring people. So you literally may lose everything. It is a big deal for business. Now, where is political risk? Well, here you have a map, and when you look at it, you will see that most of Europe and the United States may have a low political risk, but it's not very low. Some of the reasons why these countries don't rank as low on political risk are, for example, the United States. It's currently engaged in a number of conflicts, wars, Afghanistan, Iraq. So being involved in that makes you susceptible to all kinds of political instability, terrorism attacks and stuff like that. So while obviously doing business in the United States is still very safe and the risk of political instability is low, or political risk is low, it's not as low as, for example, it is in Finland. Now note, this map is about a year and a half old, and note that, for example, Ukraine and Russia on this map are shown as low risk. And think about what's going on in those countries now, again in 2015, as I'm videotaping this lecture. Terrible. So those things often are not quite predictable, or at least they happen where you expect them least. Again, where would you rather do business? If you dare to do business in those red areas, you may be up for some serious profits, because not many people are willing to risk their investment and do business there. So yes, it will be less comfortable. You literally may lose your life one day, but if you succeed, that's where you can make some real money. Just think about that. Now let me give you more examples of how political risk affected real companies. For example, some years ago, ExxonMobil had to withdraw from Indonesia due to violence against its facilities. So the locals there saw the international companies as basically new age colonizers, and there was literally violence against their property. Some oil rigs were blown up, and some personnel were beaten up. And so after trying and experimenting with different approaches, eventually ExxonMobil decided to simply withdraw from the country. Then we'll look at, for example, the economically viable project of building a gas pipeline from the Middle East to Europe via Turkey. As you may know, Russia is the main supplier of natural gas to Europe. Most of the pipelines go through Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine have a number of conflicts, and just about every year, towards the end of the year, they start this game of renegotiating the natural gas supply contracts. Ukraine threatens to stop transit of natural gas. Russia threatens to stop supply of natural gas. They fight. As a result, that creates all kinds of risks for the European consumers of natural gas that may be left without this valuable resource if Ukraine and Russia do not reach an agreement. So at some point, the European Union considered alternative ways of getting natural gas or alternative suppliers of natural gas. And as you know, there is a lot of that in the Middle East, primarily in Iran, as well as some other countries of the region. And so there were proposals of building a gas pipeline basically through Turkey, through the south, and going to the European Union. For Russia, it would be a big loss, economic loss. And so one of the, as people call him, the mouth of Kremlin, Mr. Zhirinovsky, who kind of technically is an independent politician, but is known to say what Kremlin wants to say but is not allowed to say. And so he said literally, if needed, if that Nabucco project, that pipeline project goes ahead, if needed, we will make sure that Turkey, Israel, Iran will burn in regional wars, but we will not let that project happen. And so this is more of a political statement than an economic statement. But would you be willing to sink billions of dollars in building something that may literally blow up or burn one day? So the project is still on hold. I mean, apparently it's still on the table, but no progress is made in that direction. Then go to Latin America. Doing business in Latin America may be a profitable enterprise, but kidnappings are not unusual, and so if you want to send your expatriates to Latin America or hire people there, in many cases you would need to budget for some serious defense measures, like bodyguards for the employers, like office security, and that can add up to $1 million per year, sometimes per personnel unit, one person, or per office. Again, it's a serious risk that you need to consider and take and defend against. Finally, you hear a lot about, for example, kidnappings or hijackings of tankers or trade vessels in the Indian Ocean, especially off the coast of Somalia. The Somalian pirates would seize a vessel and demand a ransom. And while this looks like like modern day piracy, to a large extent it's a political issue. And so you probably have seen the movie called Captain Phillips, where something like that happened to an American vessel. Shortly after those events, a Ukrainian tanker was seized, and a ransom of $40 million was paid they demanded $10 million, and the ransom was paid, but the oil in the tanker was worth $40 million. And so eventually the ransom was paid and the vessel was released. But again, this is quite a serious issue, and if you want to send goods through that region, most companies, they would hire guards, armed guards, who will presumably be helping to fend off the the pirates who potentially can seize your property. Again, while it looks like it's pure criminal, it actually arises from the political situation in the country and desperation caused by the unstable political situation and poor economy. So all those things have to be taken into account. Now again, asking you what parts of the world are least risky. If you're going to have an exam, you will have that question. And looking at the map, obviously the answer is B. Now, how can you minimize political risk? Well, companies get really creative in dealing with political risk, and so clearly before you go to a new country, you want to gather up as much information as possible so that your personnel is properly prepared and trained. You want to adapt while you are there. Like, for example, if you see the picture here of McDonald's arches, McDonald's of Canada would always have that Canadian maple leaf on the arch. And while Canadians are not known for, being violent against foreign companies, McDonald's wants to keep it safe, and so they put the Canadian leaf on the arch so that they look kind of more local, don't look foreign. In many cases, companies would try to establish closer ties with the people in power, like the politicians or government officials, and in many cases that may involve some creative accounting or bribing. Many companies would also use all kinds of PR, public relations, again, to either look local or look good. And so all those can potentially help you minimize political risk or defend yourself if something goes wrong in the country and you may have to deal with that uncertainty. Legal system differences are a fascinating topic. First, there are three main or basic types of legal systems. Most people, by the way, don't know what those are. We have here common law, we have civil law, and we have theocratic law. Let me talk about each one of them separately. Well, first of all, let me compare the common law and civil law systems. Common law exists in, common law countries. So that's basically the United Kingdom and its former colonies, like Canada, the United States, Australia, a few other countries. Civil law, that's pretty much everywhere else, with the exception of the theocratic law, which we'll discuss in more detail in a minute. Now, there are some very important differences between those systems, not necessarily making one of them better and one of them worse. They're just different. The biggest and most important difference between the civil law and common law systems is that in the common law system, the law is the rulings on the earlier similar cases. So the precedent, basically. So every time a decision is made on a case, that decision effectively becomes the law. So if a similar case is brought up to the court at some point, the way the decision will be made is relevant cases will be reviewed. It will be basically reviewed for what kind of decision was made on this topic before, and then the judge would be required to rule in this particular case the way similar cases were decided in the past. So it's all about precedent. So if that happened before, we have to be consistent, and the same crime has to be punished the same way. In a civil law country, the system would work differently. You would have basically a book with the laws, and so that they would be written by whatever the institution in the country writes the laws, either the parliament or some sort of a specialized institution that writes the law, and then the parliament approves it. And so the judge would not be consulting the earlier rulings on a similar law, but would literally look in the book and see what the book says. So that makes the common law system more, in a sense, consistent, but at the same time much more complicated. So when you, for example, watch movies about American lawyers, you would always, or maybe see pictures of American lawyers, you would always see them, smiling and happy or serious, whatever the picture. But in the background, you would see stacks and stacks of books, and those books are basically the law. So they would contain decisions, or they would contain the options that they're called, on all cases in all of the history of the country, as far back as possible in that particular sector of the law. And so when you have, for example, a lawyer in a movie, often you would have this kind of scene where a rising star lawyer has a difficult case and spends a whole night at a library or with the books at his office, and you would see stacks and stacks of books and maybe a mug of coffee, and in the morning with red eyes after working all night, he effectively argues the case. He finds similar cases from the past. He shows that the decisions there were soft, and convinces the judge and the jury that the defendant here is not guilty, or if the defendant is guilty, the punishment should be very, very mild. That doesn't really happen in Europe. The lawyers in Europe don't have to go through thousands and thousands of previous cases. They just have to read what the book says about the regulation, and this is the type of crime. Article 5 of the Section 3, paragraph 28 says that, for a crime like this, the defendant should be punished with, 1 to 3 years in prison. So it's much simpler, much more straightforward, and it doesn't matter how previous similar cases were ruled or decided in the past. It is also worth noting that even in the common law countries, not every branch of law or every area of law is based on the precedent. Many laws, in fact, a huge number of laws, especially related to economic regulations. So those in many cases would be, encoded in books as opposed to, judged based on previous cases. So it's usually some sort of a mix, but in a pure form, yes, common law, it's all about precedent. A civil law, it's all about what the agreed upon set of rules or a legal document says. So as a result, the common law system is much more complicated, and so you would have the options or the decisions that are very, very long. So the judge would, go and discuss at length the previous cases and explains, his rationale in thinking, and then make the decision. Whereas in the civil law countries, the decisions are usually quite simple and quite short. In the common law countries, again, because of the complexity and ambiguity in many cases, you would have judges normally who are kind of more senior people, lawyers with rich experience, whereas again in Europe, mainly the civil law system, judges kind of trained and appointed separately from attorneys. In fact, in some countries, you can literally get a degree to, in a sense, be a judge, and so you can become a judge right after graduation. So again, one of the reasons the system, common law system, is so complicated, it's not even that you have to go through thousands of previous cases. The thing is that you have inevitably some conflicts in the previous rulings. Jurisdictions frequently overlap, and so you have all that complexity built in. You find some cases that are similar and were ruled one way, some cases that are similar that were ruled another way. You're not sure if you should take cases from your, local jurisdiction, from your state, federal. So all that creates a sort of ambiguity. So as a result, again, in the common law countries, the jury of peers becomes extremely important. Whereas again, in civil law countries, often there is no jury of peers, so often it's just the judge who decides. And as I said, the attorney's job in the common law country would be to go through tons and tons of previous cases, select the right one, the relevant ones, the ones that support your defendant's point of view, and use them to sway the decision of the jury and the judge. Whereas in a civil law country, attorneys basically just have to know what's in the book and don't really need to know much about what's the previous precedents. So that makes it quite different. Now the theocratic law is yet different. So that's the law that is based on religious texts, and normally you see that in the Muslim world. So you would have a number of countries in the Middle East where Quran is basically the law, and again, to some extent, Jewish law, again, some of the regulations would be based on the religious texts. Now, if I were to ask you what system does the United States have, the answer would be common law. If I would to ask you what system does the European Union have, or most of the European Union countries, the answer would be yes, mainly civil law. And again, most countries today have civil law systems, but there are quite a few that have common law systems and some that have theocratic law systems. Now, the laws are different, so what? Who cares? Okay, we know, but what does it mean? Well, different laws mean different procedures. Your contracts may have to be written up different ways. They may be interpreted differently. If you happen to have a conflict with your business partners or customers or suppliers, the way the decision will be made on who's right and who's wrong may be different. So you may need to have a different set of skills, especially for your company lawyers. And in some countries, for example, the decisions would be frequently made by the lawyers. So it's my lawyer will see your lawyer, and you kind of step back and wait for the official decision. In other countries, like for example in Japan, in many cases the decision would be made by kind of senior officials, either of the group or of the companies, and it would be made in the back room and then just announced to the stakeholders or to the general public. Same things, so there would be all kinds of differences in terms of how you protect your intellectual property, patents, trademarks, copyright. So there would be all kinds of views on that, and again, if something goes wrong, those issues may be treated and judged very differently in different countries. Now, a fascinating topic, and I strongly encourage you to read about it, is what we call the Islamic Law and Banking. I was first exposed to this issue a few years ago when I was selling a house in the United States here, and one of the potential buyers wanted to buy it, but he wanted me to, in a sense, self-finance it, but not quite finance as you would do with a mortgage. He said or asked me if I would be willing to increase the price of the house somewhat, but give him a few years to pay for that house. And I was curious as to why, and he said, well, you see, I'm from the Middle East, and I believe he was from Saudi Arabia, and our law, the Quran, prohibits us, or believes or says that it's wrong to charge interests on loans. And so he cannot go to the bank and get a mortgage, because a mortgage clearly has an interest embedded in it. So when you get a loan from the bank to buy a house, you would be required to pay back the principal, the actual money that you borrowed, plus some interest, which according to the Islamic law is unlawful. And so eventually I wasn't able to offer him that deal because he wanted 10 years to pay for my house, and I just didn't have that time. I needed the money to buy a new house. But I started researching this topic, and it turns out that it is a big deal. So in the Middle East, it is kind of a hindrance or a barrier to effective business practices. So borrowing money, as you know, is important if you want to grow your business. So financing is important. But if you cannot loan money for interest, you have no incentive to loan money, to give money to anyone. And so as a result, nobody wants to loan money. So as a result, nobody can borrow money. And as a result, economic growth is, stalled. So Indonesia is one of the countries that is a Islamic country, but at the same time, it's not right in the Middle East. So it's kind of, between the two worlds. And so they've become experts at inventing instruments for doing business in the Islamic world. So what they do is they come up with all kinds of, for example, instruments where you get money from me, but you will not pay me the interest. We will share the profits, for example. So I give you the money and you invest it, but you will share the profits with me. So this way it makes interesting for me to give money to you, but at the same time there will be no interest per se paid on the, I don't even want to call it a loan, though in a case it is a loan. And so there are all kinds of other instruments like this that they are inventing constantly, and that enables money exchange and basically borrowing money without violating the Islamic law. And so here is a link to Wikipedia, to a Wikipedia article that I recommend that you read if you are interested in this topic. A very, very interesting issue that you would never think would be an issue, but turns out it is, and a solution needs to be made in order, to solve this problem without violating the law. Now, what laws are different or differ most from a country to country? When I ask that question, somehow students always think about, a chopped off hand. If you steal in some countries, they will chop off your hand. And yes, the punishment may vary from a country to country, but the reality is that the criminal law actually doesn't vary too much. So in just about any system, any country, stealing is wrong, killing is wrong, lying is wrong. So, the things that you would call criminal offenses tend to be viewed the same way. And yes, it is true that the extent of the punishment may be drastically different, but other than that, it's pretty much, everywhere universally perceived that, criminal activities are bad, and most people agree on what constitutes crime. The laws that differ most are the copyright laws, product safety and liability laws, antitrust or anti-monopoly laws, and taxation laws. So those are very different. So for example, copyright, in some countries it's perfectly acceptable to download, for example, music on the internet, pirated copies. It's in many cases the only way people get the music. In other countries it is a criminal offense, and you will get a real time in prison for that. Product safety and liability. You probably all have heard about that, notorious case when a woman drives in McDonald's, drive-through, orders coffee, spills it accidentally on her breasts, and burns them, and gets a huge compensation from McDonald's. So that's in the United States. In some other countries it would be very different. You slip on the wet floor in a store in, for example, Latin America, Africa, or Ukraine, and you will not be expecting any compensation from the store owner. In fact, they'll just kick you out and say, well, be careful next time. Again, in the United States, if you work in a store, and I've heard that story many times from my students, a droplet of water on the floor, either due to rain or some spilling accident, the employees would literally run to that spot to put the sign, careful, caution, wet floor, because if there is no sign and a customer slips on it, it's a huge liability for the store. And in fact, some people have been known to take advantage of that situation, so they would also run to that puddle to slip and break arm first before the employee gets to it. So it's very important. And then antitrust laws, again, Microsoft or Google tend to be much more often in trouble in Europe for allegedly monopolizing the market than they are, for example, in the United States, where these regulations are much more relaxed. And then taxation, it's a whole different story. So the extent of number of taxes you pay, the level of taxes you pay, how it's done, so very, very different from country to country. Talking about copyright laws, well, you probably have heard a lot about all that copyright violation in China, how your product designs can be stolen, counterfeits can be sold. There was a very interesting story a few years ago about a pirated Apple store. So apparently somewhere in China there was a store that was marketed and presented as an Apple store, but it was not owned by Apple. So they literally not only pirated some of the goods, but actually pirated the entire store idea. And apparently even the employees there didn't know that they were working not for Apple, but for someone else. I've heard that story was not entirely true, and I'm not sure about that, so you might want to research it on the web. But the whole idea of a piracy of this kind in China, many people wouldn't be surprised. I should note though that China today is very different from China 10-20 years ago. So China is actually starting to take copyright laws and intellectual property more and more seriously, as more and more local companies there now depend on strict legal protection of their intellectual property. The country, the state takes more seriously those kinds of areas of life, and it seems like now they implemented more and more regulations, so the situation is rapidly improving. But then again, there are many countries on the planet left where intellectual property, copyright, is not protected in any way at all. Same thing about, talking about perceptions of ethics. In some countries, even the smallest gift may be perceived as a bribe. In other countries, it may not only be perceived as ethical, but it may even be tax deductible. Again, up until not so long ago, in Germany, for example, bribes or gifts or whatever you want to call them to officials in foreign countries to get contracts were not only allowed, but were tax deductible. Go figure. Same thing again, would it be ethical to download a movie or a music, a song, a pirated copy of the internet? Again, in the United States, most of my students normally agree that no, it's unethical, it's wrong, and even though most admit that they've done it, at least sometimes, they kind of see it as unethical. In other countries, when I ask that question, like in Colombia, in Ukraine, in some Eastern European countries, students often say, yeah, it's kind of okay. I mean, I don't see anything wrong about that. I mean, it may not be entirely right or not legal, but I wouldn't see that as necessarily unethical. So there are certain differences, and those differences may affect your business practices and the way you do business. So going back to the bribes versus financial incentives. So in 2007, for example, so Siemens, or Siemens as they say, the German company, was in trouble for apparently bribing governmental officials in Nigeria, Russia, Libya, and they did have to pay a fine at that time, 201 million euros. But then again, at that time they argued that in Germany it was not only legal but even tax deductible, whereas in the countries where they used the practices it was illegal, and so they ended up being punished for that. So not so easy. All right, here's a question, and the answer is criminal. Criminal laws don't differ much. I mean, the extent of the punishment may differ, but what's perceived wrong or interpreted as wrong based on the law. So as far as criminal activity, usually it's fairly consistent from a country to country. The other four on the list here, very, very different from a country to country. Now here's what you need to know on the exam in order to do well. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you next lecture.